I want to thank you all very much for coming today for discussion of Jason Riley's new book, The Black Boom. I'm Brian Anderson. I'm the editor of City Journal, and Jason Riley is on my right here. He's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He's an opinion columnist at the Wall Street Journal. He's a commentator for Fox News. He was the 2018 recipient of the Bradley Prize, which honors scholars whose work reflects the principles and institutions of American exceptionalism. His column, Upward Mobility, which is a theme in this book, has run in the Wall Street Journal since 2016. He's written extensively on politics, economics, education, immigration, race, and he's the author of 5 books, most notably last year, a wonderful biography of the economist Thomas Sowell called Maverick. Today, though, we're going to discuss his latest book, which will be on sale and is on sale at the back of the room. It's called The Black Boom, and it provides an analysis, a really brisk and powerful analysis of black economic progress during the Trump presidency prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. So, Jason, let me start with a simple question. Your book examines the economic policies implemented under the Trump presidency that led to very significant pre-pandemic economic gains among black Americans. This included employment gains, wage gains, reductions in poverty and inequality. So I wonder if you could sketch out the basic argument with some of those gains, and then what policies specifically you think brought them about.
Well, thank you, Brian, for doing this, and I want to thank the Manhattan Institute and all of you for taking the time to be here this afternoon. I wanted to write this book because I thought this was a very underreported story, and I sort of take my profession to task. I think the media was so focused on resisting the Trump presidency from day one that they were reluctant to give it credit for anything. And I thought that was a sort of dereliction of duty by the media and by journalists whose job is to report the news, and they sort of put objectivity and fairness to the side in order to attempt to take down the Trump presidency rather than simply report what was going on, which is their job. And it was especially ironic because in this case, this story I wanted to tell is a story they otherwise obsess over: income inequality, social inequality, racial inequality. The media can't go, speak 3 straight sentences without that coming up. And in the pre-COVID economy under Trump, we saw very good news on this front. Black-white gaps in incomes were shrinking. Black unemployment reached record lows. Black poverty reached record lows. And black incomes rose at a faster rate than white incomes. I titled the book The Black Boom, but it's really a sort of working class boom that I'm describing. It just so happens that blacks, and to some extent Hispanics, are overrepresented among the working class, so many of these benefits redounded to them especially. But this was good news. This was great news, and I thought they were reluctant to talk about it. And so this is the story I wanted to tell, and I think it's an important story to tell, not to score partisan points. I was not a supporter of Donald Trump in 2016 or 2020, but I do care about, like a lot of people, income inequality and social inequality and upward mobility. And if policies that he put in place or advanced or supported helped reduce inequality in this country, we should be talking about that. Why was it happening? What can we do to continue down that path? And so that's the story I try and tell in the book.
Well, getting to those policies, what do you think was the spur to this remarkable boom?
In a nutshell, economic growth. at the end of the day, what we learned is that black Americans and low-income Americans of all stripes need tight labor markets more than they need a woke president. That seems to be the key to upward mobility in this country, and that's what we got under Trump prior to COVID. We got faster economic growth, and just to put it in perspective, you have to realize how bad things got, particularly for blacks, under the Obama presidency economically. Unemployment, which never reached double digits for whites under Obama, did not fall below double digits for blacks until the 3rd month of Obama's 7th year in office. Under Trump, black unemployment again fell to 50-year lows. Black poverty fell to its lowest level on record. You saw black wages rising at more than 15% among blacks, but only 11% among whites. May not seem like a lot, but that's a 36% difference. That is not just a continuation of something that was happening under Obama, as some people like to dismiss it. It was an acceleration. For the lowest income earners in this country, their wages under the first 3 years of the Trump administration grew at more than double the rate that they did during Obama's 2nd term. This was an acceleration that we saw. And what's noteworthy also were the expectations at the time that Trump took office. So just to take you back, in 2015, which was the 2nd to last year of the Obama presidency, economic growth in this country was 3.1%, good clip. But during 2016, Obama's final year in office, economic growth fell almost in half to 1.6%. That is the economy that Trump inherited, an economy in which growth had fallen by half in 1 year. People were anticipating a recession. People like Larry Summers, the Fed, the Congressional Budget Office said unemployment cannot go any lower. Growth cannot continue any faster. We're at the end of a business cycle. We can't get any more job growth out of this business cycle. That is the economy that Trump inherited. Those were the expectations at the time, yet we saw faster growth. We saw more job creation. We saw lower unemployment month after month after month. And so I say to the folks who say, oh, Obama handed Trump off a great economy, anybody was going to see what we saw under Trump. I say no, that's trying to have it both ways. That's a heads I win, tails you lose argument. Because if things had gone sideways under Trump, do you think they would have blamed Obama?
Right.
But because things went well, they want to give Obama the credit, and I don't think they can have it both ways.
There were certainly a lot of media predictions of economic doom.
Yes.
Prior to the election, if Trump were elected. So Paul Krugman was warning that markets might never recover if he was elected, and that, and this is a quote, we are very probably looking at a global recession with no end in sight if Trump's economic policies were implemented. That obviously turned out to be wildly inaccurate. But what specifically was it about the Trump economic agenda? How much of the success of those pre-pandemic years was due to components like the tax cuts,
yes,
deregulation, or how much was bound up with some of his more populist arguments, such as the tariffs that were imposed on China or limiting immigration.
Well, I make a case in the book that the corporate tax reform, in particular, was central. The rate is 35%. Trump cut it to 21%. You got full expensing of new equipment. This incentivized investment, which is what happened. Corporate investment, which had been falling prior to the tax cut, passed it in 2017, went up by close to 10% in the following 2 years. Money was repatriated. It was invested here. So I think this had a huge impact on incentivizing businesses to hire and to increase productivity. And for existing workers, I think this put upward pressure on wages, and that's what we saw. And I mean, the results were they were quite incredible, and I laugh because of how little attention it got at the time. But it was across the board. You know, these were sold as policies that would only help wealthy individuals, but in fact, the pay of workers rose faster than the pay of their bosses over the same time period. So the effects were very broad based.
Well, you have a remarkable statistic in the book, which notes that in 2019, the growth in median income was the largest ever recorded.
Okay. And
that it amounted to more than all 8 years under Obama.
Yes.
Combined.
Yes.
So
yes.
that was.
Yes. And that was, median income grew in 2 years by $5,000 between 2018 and 2019, which is more than it grew in the previous 8 years combined. It was quite remarkable. Yeah. And so you couple that with something else he did, which was lighter regulation on corporations, and it really wasn't so much that the regulatory burden decreased, so much as the Trump administration stopped adding to it. And what I describe in the book is just how many more regulations were added year after year after year under Obama. And Trump really slowed that down remarkably. Businesses got some sense of certainty, what they could count on going forward. I mean, there were environmental all kinds of regulations that he was imposing on the business sector, and Trump really put a pause on that. And I think that too had a tremendous impact on the willingness and ability of companies to plan ahead and invest domestically.
There's been two arguments about this economic growth made by Democrats and in the media, one of which you've addressed, that Trump just inherited an Obama-created economy that was growing vigorously. So I think you've addressed that to a bit. The other argument, though, is that a lot of the gains were due to state-level increases in the minimum wage.
Yes, yes.
You devote a chapter to the book,
yeah,
in the book, to this argument. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So an argument made on the left is that states were increasing their state minimums, and that was what was responsible for any wage gains we saw, particularly for lower income workers. This had nothing to do with the tax reform, and had everything to do with states lifting the wage floor. And there are a few problems with that argument, but the first one is a sort of quantitative problem. Only a tiny fraction of workers in this country earn the federal minimum. It's about 2 or 3%. The state minimum is a little higher, can be higher than the federal minimum, but even there, you're only talking about 7 or 8% of the workforce. there just aren't enough of these people to be driving the trends that we saw during this period. So that's your quantitative problem. The other thing there is if Tennessee or Michigan decides to lift their minimum wage on, say, January 1st, 2019, you would expect to see wages in Tennessee and Michigan go up in January. But you would not expect to see them go up in February, and again in March, and again in April, which is what we saw happening under Trump. So I think the minimum wage argument is an unsatisfactory explanation of what we saw. The other problem with the minimum wage argument is that there are trade-offs to raising your minimum wage. And I cite some examples in the book, places like Seattle, which had lifted their wage floors to what they considered a living wage, frankly. And some studies were done over what happened in the Seattle area. So if you earn the minimum wage, you're going to make more money if that wage is increased by law, provided you, A, keep your job and keep working the same number of hours, neither of which is guaranteed when that wage goes up. And what these studies found was that people's work hours were cut after the minimum wage was increased. Cut to the extent that at the end of the day, they were making less money per week than they had been making prior to increasing the minimum wage. So that is something that the minimum wage advocates don't take into account, these trade-offs that occur with these minimum wage hikes.
Your book focuses on the pre-pandemic period during the Trump years. But what about afterwards? Has COVID undone the progress that you're writing about in this book completely? What does this situation look like now?
It has largely undone a lot of these gains. We're seeing unemployment rates go back up, not to Obama levels yet, but they are going back up. And more disturbingly, what we're seeing is the current administration want to go back to Obama-era policies. The whole Build Back Better effort is an expansion, a massive expansion of the welfare state. They want to reverse the tax reforms that were enacted under Trump, raise the corporate rate, raise taxes on higher earners. These were all policies that led to the slow growth that we saw in the Obama years. And my concern is that these policies will reproduce those results. And I don't think people want to go backwards in that sense. And it's, in a way, Biden wants to go further than the Obama policies. I mean, he's looking to push handouts well into the middle class. People making six-figure incomes would qualify for government handouts under some of these policies being pushed. So I think we're in a very bad way right now in terms of the current agenda of the administration. Right now, it hasn't been going anywhere, but I hope that continues to be the case. The other thing we're learning is how devastating inflation can be, particularly on the incomes of lower income individuals. The previous administration didn't get a lot of credit for keeping inflation intact, but even now, today, where we still see wages rising, prices are rising faster and eating up all of those wage gains that we see. And so, I think we're very much still recovering from the pandemic on the fronts that I discuss in the book.
I wonder if you could say a little bit more about something you've just suggested, this shift with the Biden administration back toward a kind of welfare policy-centric approach to poverty. It's a long-running theme, not just in this book, but in a lot of your writing, that disadvantaged Americans benefit more from opportunity, entrepreneurship, free markets than they could from these kind of redistributive programs.
Yeah.
So I wonder, if you could elaborate a little bit more on why that's the case.
Sure. And as I stress in the book, these policies that led to the outcomes we saw prior to the pandemic, Trump didn't reinvent the wheel here. We've seen this happen before when the economy was growing. It happened in the post-war period. It happened in the 90s under Bill Clinton. When the economy was growing, we saw the wages of lower income workers rising fastest. So this is what happens when you grow an economy at a sufficient pace, and people have access to labor markets. They're able to take advantage of this. There have been some recent studies put out by people on the left and right. One by Richard Vedder, a labor economist at Ohio University, and the same work has been cited by Robert Putnam of Harvard University, who's a liberal. And they have both pointed to the post-war period from the late 40s to the early 1970s as the period in history where blacks have made the greatest economic gains since slavery. Late 40s to early 70s. And you think about what else was going on in the country at that time that would argue against that, that would seem to work against black advancement. Most of that is Jim Crow. Most of that is a period of time when you could put a sign in your window that said, "We don't hire blacks," and it was perfectly legal. You can't go to school here. You can't work in this industry. Redlining. You can't live in this neighborhood. And yet, blacks saw the fastest gains in this. And you go, why? Well, why was it? It was a post-war economy. Labor markets were tight. Strong economic growth. All groups were benefiting, though blacks were benefiting more. In the 1960s alone, black incomes doubled in this country. They went up for whites as well, but not as fast as they did for blacks. Blacks were leaving poverty at record rates in the 1940s and 50s. And you also think about what was yet to come. There was no affirmative action. That's the 70s. There was no Great Society yet until the late 1960s. After which, all these trends began to slow, if not reverse course or stall. So again, to me, it points to what is most important in terms of the welfare of low-income individuals, low-income racial and ethnic groups, even groups that are being discriminated against. What they most need is economic growth. And when our political leaders deliver that, we see good things happen. What they don't need most is wealth redistribution policies, a larger welfare state, racial preferences, and so forth, which is what those on the left tend to want to give them as a way to help them. That's, however, is not, history doesn't show that is what they most need.
I wonder, we were talking a bit about this before this panel, about the political appeal of a growth agenda to minority voters. So you discuss the findings of the Democratic strategist David Shore in the book, that the Democrats' increasing focus on progressive cultural policies in gender and race is actually alienating an increasing number of Hispanic and black voters, especially working class voters. Trump, as has been widely noted, did better among black and Hispanic voters than GOP presidential candidates had done for quite a while. And polls are now suggesting a very significant shift among Hispanics toward the GOP. Sure. So, I wonder if you think this trend has legs, what really explains it?
Sure. I differentiate between a little bit between what's going on with blacks and what's going on with Hispanics. Trump did do better in 2020 among blacks, particularly among black men, than he'd done in 2016. But that's a very low bar, and let me explain why. you go back to, say, the Ford administration, and blacks or Republicans are winning 10, 11, 12% of the black vote pretty consistently, going back to Ford. And then for Romney, or first for McCain in 2008, and then for Romney in 2012, it goes way down. But of course, they had to run against Obama. In 2016, Trump didn't have that excuse the way Romney and McCain did. Obama wasn't on the ticket. So he improved in 2020, but he only really brought it back up to the sort of pre-Obama level, or close to that level. Among Hispanics, however, it was, I think, a much more real, significant improvement. And I think it had a lot to do, again, it was particularly, it was all Hispanics, or Hispanics broadly speaking, but it wasn't just Cubans but a lot of Mexicans. It was a lot of different Hispanic groups, and again, it was mostly men driving this, or his performance was strongest against men. And I think what you saw happening in 2020, both among black men and Hispanic men, was his focus on reopening the economy. A lot of these are service sector workers, hospitality, retail, people who couldn't do their jobs from home. And Trump's focus on reopening the economy, getting people back into the workplace, I think resonated with them on top of the income data I cited. These folks were doing quite well for the first 3 years of the Trump administration, and very well could have been voting on that, notwithstanding all of the noise on the left that they had, this bigot in the White House that they should not want anything to do with. But you mentioned Shore's analysis, and his analysis essentially says, and this is a liberal, democratic, liberal, progressive political analyst, who has said that the left's problem has been that they've been catering lately to their progressive wing, which tends to be highly educated whites. And they have been neglecting their blue-collar ethnic and racial minorities, Democrats. And that the Republicans are benefiting from this. And I think there is something to that. There is not a lot of overlap between the agenda that these white liberal educated elites want and what these ethnic blue collar less educated minority types are pushing for on all types of issues, whether it's school choice, whether it's immigration, whether there are all types of divisions within the Democratic Party on these issues, and Shore is saying that the leaders have been neglecting the ethnic minorities to their detriment for too long, and I think there is something to that.
It would be a huge political shift if this does.
Well,
right?
And you see it now in the numbers with Hispanics, which who seem to be for the midterms really up for grabs, and it's there among blacks as well, and the numbers are deceiving because Biden's support among blacks is still in the high 60s, low 70s. You go, oh, that's still pretty strong. But it's not as strong as it needs to be for Democrats. If a Democratic candidate isn't getting 80+% of the black vote, he's in trouble. So for Biden to be in the 60s, or anywhere near the 60s, is apocalyptic for Democrats. So it may seem like a high amount, but that amount of slippage is not something they can really afford. They really count on 85-90% of the black vote, turning out and then throwing their vote to Democrats, and so they are worried. They are worried. I think Shore is onto something.
Let's talk a little bit about the role of education in black economic progress, which is another ongoing theme of your writing in the journal and elsewhere. Black students are overrepresented in below average and failing schools. They are more likely than white students to receive instruction from inexperienced teachers. They're more likely to encounter violence at school and be surrounded by peers from low-income households. So given these circumstances, many policymakers and pundits suggest that disparities in education are really to blame for the black-white achievement gap, which is very stubborn, and in turn, the black-white wealth gap, which you're writing about a bit in this book. So would improving the educational opportunities for black students give them what they need to catch up to some degree to their white and Asian peers, or does this diagnosis neglect other factors, do you think, that are needed for black prosperity?
Well, in terms of what policymakers can do, I think school choice can go a long way towards doing the types of things that will help close that achievement gap. And we know this because we have school models out there that have closed the achievement gap. We have charter schools, we have Catholic schools, we have private non-sectarian schools that are producing the outcomes we'd like to see. The charter school networks, high-performing charter school networks in New York and elsewhere have produced kids with test scores on standardized exams that outperform. These are not only schools that are overwhelmingly black and Hispanic, they're overwhelmingly low-income black and Hispanic kids that are outperforming their white peers in the liliest white suburbs, wealthiest suburbs in this country. And so we know that the models are there to get the job done. It's a matter of multiplying them, scaling them up, and that's the real challenge, and whether there's a political will to do that. And current trends here are very disturbing because this was something school reformers had a lot of buy-in from Democrats and liberals on charters for decades. Bill Clinton was a strong supporter of charter schools. Barack Obama was a supporter, vocal supporter of charter schools. They used to draw the line at vouchers or tax credits, but they were on board for charter schools. The Biden administration is trying to crush charter schools. They have put forward some rulemakings that would make it very difficult for charter schools to have access to federal funds, which they are heavily dependent on in order to grow. This is by design. This is designed to crush charter school growth in this country. So there's been a sharp turn on charters among Democrats in recent years, and I find that very, very disturbing. But you alluded to other factors that may be involved, and you're right, Brian. I mean, it's not all about what outsiders or policymakers or politicians can do. There's also a culture of learning, a culture of anti-intellectualism, attitudes towards schools, attitudes towards being smart in class, being bookish, fears of acting white, peer pressure, and things like that. And those are cultural issues. That's something largely outside the purview of educators. I mean, we can do things to not exacerbate that. We can ask policy makers to do things to not exacerbate that, but that is something these communities, I think, ultimately are going to have to deal with from within, and there are no shortcuts there.
Yeah, a project of cultural renewal, in other words. Yeah. Part of your book, and maybe this is the last question before we turn to audience questions. Part of your book, as you've mentioned, is devoted to explaining why these remarkable economic gains during the first 3 years of the Trump presidency went unacknowledged by the press. What has, and you work in journalism, you know journalists, what has happened to the press during this period? You mention in the book the essay by the writer Martin Gurry on post-journalism, that the press has always sort of tilted left in modern memory, but something else seems to have happened over the last 5 years. And I wonder, as somebody who works in this industry, what your thoughts are about that.
They've lost their marbles. I mean, it's that. No,
it sounds kind of cool, post-journalism, but what does that really mean?
It's,
right? So,
this is a group, this is an industry that didn't have a lot of credibility to begin with. But whatever it did have, it certainly threw away during the Trump years. They, again, just decided to put aside all professionalism, objectivity, fairness, and decided to become political activists in a way that they had never done before, or at least in modern times. I mean, we do know that the media has long leaned left, particularly the Washington media, the Washington press corps, political journalists, and you can show this empirically. There have been studies done that 80% of reporters and editors who cover the White House vote Democrat, 80+%. That data goes back decades. So we know, and they can pretend that this has no influence on their coverage, but so we know that. But something different happened during the Trump years, where the media felt it was its job not to just ask questions at these press briefings, but to berate the president. And that was different. And part of the problem here is you can't just turn this stuff off and on like a light switch. And now that Trump is no longer there, the media can't go back to its viewers and readers and listeners and go, oh, he's gone, now we're going to play it down the middle, and you should trust everything we say as objective. It doesn't work that way. And I think we're seeing the results of that. The press has a credibility problem like it's never had before, and I don't know when, if ever, it will be able to earn back the trust of the audience. It's a big problem. It's a very big problem.
The polling certainly bears that out. It's one of the least trusted institutions in American society now.